What do you picture when you hear the word siege? Most likely, your imagination, shaped by cinema, paints vivid and violent pictures. Brave warriors climbing ladders under a hail of arrows, the crash of collisions at broken gates, and a quick, decisive outcome that fits into 10 minutes of screen time. But what if I told you that all of this was just the final moments of a long, grueling 9-month game? The real medieval siege was not a sprint, but a marathon for survival. It was a titanic battle, not so much of steel as of minds, not so much of armies as of resources, and, most importantly, it was a great contest of patience. Today we will tell you what really happened in the shadows of the giant walls during the long months of preparation, about the invisible war that predetermined the outcome of the great confrontation. It all began not with the clanging of weapons, but with a tense silence. Imagine a council chamber in a royal castle. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of melting wax from hundreds of candles and the acrid aroma of old maps spread out on a massive oak table. The ruler and his most trusted advisors, the gray-bearded treasurer, the grim military commander, and the astute diplomat, leaned over a huge sheet of parchment. On it, a skilled cartographer depicted the enemy's stronghold, its towers, walls, and approaches with incredible accuracy. Every glance, every gesture was full of meaning, because the decision being made here could empty the treasury and forever change the fate of an entire region. A full-scale siege was the most expensive and risky undertaking that a medieval state could undertake. Sometimes the cost of a single campaign exceeded the total annual income of the entire kingdom. It required the mobilization of all resources, from hiring thousands of soldiers to gathering provisions and purchasing timber. Therefore, it was a step that was taken only after long and cold analysis, weighing every coin, every person, and every possible outcome. After the ruler affixed his seal to the decree, a special, thick silence hung in the hall, the silence of accepted responsibility, which was heavier than any spoken word. After the decision was made, a slow, almost tectonic movement began. The army did not suddenly appear at the castle walls as if by magic. The process resembled the awakening and migration of a giant creature. Tens of thousands of people and thousands of loaded carts stretched along the dusty roads for many kilometers, creating a living, pulsating river of people, animals, and all kinds of materials. Logistics was the main invisible enemy of any commander. The army was like a slowly creeping city that had to feed, water, and supply itself. In this stream, one could hear not only the measured thud of thousands of boots, but also the incessant creaking of thousands of unlubricated wheels, the discontented lowing of oxen pulling heavy siege engines, the quiet clanging of kitchen utensils, and a continuous, many-voiced hum. Ahead of the main column were detachments of scouts and foragers, whose task was not only to study the terrain, but also to search for provisions among the local population, often leaving nothing behind. Engineers and carpenters followed, building temporary bridges across streams and repairing roads for heavy convoys to pass. It was a great migration, the outcome of which depended on every wheel and every sack of grain. For the inhabitants of the castle, it all began with an alarming report from the watchman on the highest tower. On the horizon, where the distant hills merged with the sky, a faint ripple appeared, like the trembling of hot air. Hour after hour, this ripple grew, turning into a dark, moving mass. Finally, the vanguard of the army, like cavalry, occupied key heights around the fortress, cutting off all routes of retreat. An experienced commander would first send out detachments to take control of all roads, mills, and, if possible, the stream or river that supplied the castle with drinking water. Soon, a hollow, drawn-out creak echoed throughout the castle. The heavy drawbridge was being raised with the help of winches. Behind it, with a deafening crash, a wrought iron grate descended and massive oak gates lined with iron closed. Perhaps, forever. For those inside, the world suddenly shrank to the size of stone walls. The familiar landscape beyond the walls ceased to exist, turning into hostile territory. The iron ring of siege began to tighten slowly but inexorably. At the foot of the impregnable stone walls, an incredible, almost surreal spectacle began. In just a few days, an empty field was transformed into a huge, noisy city teeming with life. The siege camp was not just a chaotic cluster of tents. It was often built according to a tried and tested Roman model, with clear, straight streets, a central square, a market, and a system of external fortifications, a moat and a rampart, to protect against sudden sorties from the castle or attacks from outside. Strict discipline was enforced in this temporary metropolis. Special officers, known as provosts, patrolled the streets, kept order, and quashed any disputes that could escalate into something more serious. But the main invisible threat was hygiene. The lack of sanitation and the crowded conditions of thousands of people and animals often led to outbreaks of disease, which could inflict far greater damage on the army than the entire garrison of the besieged castle. This temporary hive of a city lived a tense life, full of hard work, vague hopes, and constant danger. The first stage of the confrontation was not physical, but psychological. It was a battle of nerves. According to the laws of combat at that time, the figure of the herald was inviolable. He was not just a messenger, but a diplomat. Dressed in a bright tabard richly decorated with his lord's coat of arms, he fearlessly approached the walls of the fortress. To the sound of a trumpet attracting everyone's attention, he read aloud the formal terms of surrender so that the entire garrison could hear, not just the commandant. It was theater. Sometimes, in addition to direct threats, mockery was also used. Insults were shouted from a safe distance at the commandant and his family, or ugly effigies of the defenders were made out of straw and burned in full view of everyone. The goal was one: to sow seeds of doubt, fear, and disunity in the hearts of the besieged. Then a slow but inevitable transformation of the surrounding landscape began. Thousands of soldiers temporarily turned into lumberjacks. The forest that had stood at the castle walls for centuries began to reseed. The construction of powerful siege weapons required not just any wood, but a special, high-quality type. Master engineers personally went into the forest to select and mark the necessary trees. Elastic and flexible elm for the throwing levers, and oak, as strong as iron, for the supporting structures. The forest was not simply cut down, it was carefully selected. Then the painstaking work began. The logs were stripped of their bark, sawn, soaked in water, and slowly dried in the shade so that the wood would not crack or lose its properties. Each element of the future giant machine was the result of long and thoughtful labor. Under the guidance of a master engineer, a man whose knowledge was worth its weight in gold, these prepared logs were used to begin assembling giant throwing machines. The most powerful of these was the trebuchet, a colossal structure that operated on the principle of counterweight. Aiming with a trebuchet was a highly complex art, true medieval ballistics. Accuracy was achieved through a variety of adjustments. Engineers changed the weight in a huge counterweight box, selected the ideal length of the sling in which the projectile was placed, and adjusted the moment of release by bending a special hook at the end of the throwing lever. Sometimes the first shots were fired not at the castle, but at squares marked on the ground in advance to calibrate the machine and draw up firing tables. The work of tensioning the trebuchet required the coordinated efforts of dozens of people who, like ants, slowly rotated huge wheels, pulling the arm of this wooden giant. Alongside the construction of the throwing machines, even more impressive structures were being built: siege towers. These were veritable multi-story fortresses on wheels, often taller than the walls of the castle itself. The main vulnerability of these wooden giants was fire. Therefore, they were carefully protected. The walls were covered with freshly removed and still wet ox and cow hides, or lined with thick cloth soaked in vinegar to protect against flaming arrows. Inside, the tower was a multi-level platform with a system of staircases. The top tier was occupied by the best archers and crossbowmen, who could fire down on the defenders of the walls from above. The main assault unit was positioned at the middle level with a heavy portable bridge, ready to storm the wall at the decisive moment. And at the bottom, at the base, a battering ram was sometimes installed. The most frightening work was carried out in complete silence and pitch darkness. Special teams of miners, experienced miners, began digging a narrow tunnel, a sap, towards the foundation of one of the castle towers. They worked in shifts, using short picks and shovels, reinforcing the tunnel vaults with wooden supports. The castle defenders had their own methods of countering this. Experienced guards not only put their ears to the ground, trying to hear muffled blows, but also placed bowls of water or drums filled with peas around the perimeter of the walls, which reacted to the slightest vibrations. Upon discovering the direction of the tunnel, they would begin digging a counter-tunnel, a countermine. If the two tunnels met, darkness exploded into a short, fierce confrontation with no room for maneuver, and the outcome was decided in a matter of moments. But more often than not, the purpose of the countermine was simply to collapse the enemy tunnel, burying all the attackers' efforts underground. Inside the castle, cut off from the outside world, preparations for a long defense were underway, invisible from the outside. Life was completely changing. Immediately after the siege began, the experienced commandant introduced strict rationing of all vital resources. All grain from the granaries was taken to a central warehouse and ground into flour under strict supervision. Bread and water were distributed according to lists of names. Every drop and every crumb was accounted for. The blacksmiths in the castle did not forge new weapons. There were no resources for that. They repaired broken tools and straightened bent arrowheads collected after shelling. Not only stones and cauldrons filled with tar were thrown at the walls. Everything was used. Beehives, which could be dropped on the attackers, sacks of quicklime, whose powder blinded the attackers, or even just broken dishes and rubbish. But the hardest part was not supporting the walls, but the spirit of the people. Monotonous days filled with anxiety and deprivation turned into weeks, and weeks into endless months. Two figures played a key role in this psychological struggle: the castle commandant and the priest. With his outward calm, confidence, and daily rounds of the walls, the commandant had to nip the slightest signs of panic and despondency in the bud. The priest conducted daily services, heard confessions, reminded people of their duties, and gave them spiritual strength for the long ordeal. The most dangerous enemy within the walls was rumor. Whispers that food was running out, that the well had been poisoned, or that the commandant was secretly negotiating surrender could spread through the castle with lightning speed and undermine the will to resist faster than any battering ram. And then, after long weeks or even months of painstaking work, the special day arrived. The day when the main siege engines were completely ready. Their assembly was complete. Often, the most powerful and famous weapons were given their own fearsome names: the wolf, the destroyer of cities, or the name of some saint. Sometimes, to boost the morale of their own army and intimidate the enemy, a real parade was held. Ready-made trebuchets and siege towers decorated with banners and coats of arms were slowly driven along the entire camp to the approving and enthusiastic shouts of thousands of soldiers. It was a moment of triumph for the engineers and carpenters, a demonstration of unbeatable power, and a final, crushing psychological blow to the defenders, who watched this parade in horror from their walls. After the triumphal parade, perhaps the slowest, most tense, and most dangerous stage of preparation began, moving the giants into battle positions. The enormous siege tower had to be rolled up close to the wall. A perfectly flat, prepared road was required for the multi-ton siege tower. Hundreds of workers, often under fire from archers on the fortress walls, began this titanic task. Under the cover of large mobile wooden shields, they leveled the ground, filled in small ditches, and laid down sturdy wooden planks. Every meter of this road was a small but important victory, the result of enormous effort and risk, bringing the huge tower closer to the walls. The defenders, in turn, did everything they could to prevent this, firing continuously. On the last night before the start of the active phase of the assault, the besiegers' camp was filled with restrained, buzzing energy. It was not a noisy celebration. Priests conducted services, absolving sins. Commanders went around the posts, giving their final orders. Soldiers sat around the fires, but did not sing songs. They silently sharpened their weapons, checked the straps on their shields, and adjusted their equipment. In the castle, however, the atmosphere was different, more oppressive. It was a night of quiet conversations in the dim light of the barracks, a night of last instructions and desperate hope for a miracle. Everyone listened intently to the night sounds coming from the enemy camp, trying to guess what the morning would bring. With the first faint rays of sunlight, an unnatural, deafening silence descended. All the sounds of the previous night faded away. It seemed that even the wind was afraid to disturb the tense anticipation. Everything stood still. The signal to begin the assault was almost never audible, so as not to alert the enemy. Most often, it was a prearranged visual signal, the sudden raising of a specific flag on the commander's hill or the lowering of his hand. It was a silent but universally understood gesture that set the gigantic mechanism in motion. At that moment, you could hear the wind whistling through the taut ropes of the trebuchet or the last prop creaking under the wheel of the siege tower. All the months of preparation, all the hopes and fears were concentrated in that one frozen moment. And when that moment passed, the visible part of the siege began. But its outcome was like a chess game, where the endgame only confirms the advantage gained at the very beginning. The real victory or defeat was not decided in the fury of the final assault. They were decided during those long weeks and months when engineers conquered the laws of physics, when logisticians won an exhausting battle against distance and hunger, and when the spirit of one side, whether besieging or besieged, proved stronger. The final clash was merely the loud, visible culmination of a long, invisible, and much more complex contest, where it was not the fiercest who won, but the most patient.